And welcome to the Indie Game Genre Tier List 2026 edition. Starting this one a little bit early, and that is not the only thing I am doing differently. If you are new to the way I do this, this is the best genres for developers, not necessarily for the general public, although perhaps if you're the kind of person who likes having a lot of choice, the genres that are easiest to get into are going to have a lot more of these games. So, more variety, never a problem. Now, one of the other different things I'm doing, aside from starting earlier this year, is I do have these already placed, and I have them placed where I had them on my modified 2025 list. So that's after the second video I did mid-year, after I kind of rearranged things and acknowledged some of my errors. So we're going to start from that baseline, the assumption that that's more or less accurate, which it's not, and I'll point out very quickly which ones I've gotten wrong. We're going to move these around, and yeah. So let's start with an obvious one that needs moving. Deck builders need to be higher. I was pretty skeptical of deck builders, not so much because of what the numbers say. Deck builders are still doing great. They are easily one of the strongest of sort of Steam's in-house genres. Really, any of these sort of created by indie genres tend to still be doing really well, but deck builders in particular are surprisingly strong. I still think we're kind of coming to a point where you're going to hit a point of diminishing returns where people are going to start to drift away. Again, we've got Slay the Spire 2 next year, which is going to suck some of the oxygen out of the room. Allegedly, that's coming out in March, although I'm fully prepared for it to be pushed back, because they usually are. But I'm willing to move it up, because I definitely had it too low, but I'm not willing to move it above positive outlook. It's in an okay place. Now, looking through the rest of these, I'm going to move City Builders down a spot to where I had them originally. It's a good genre for small, especially really small teams. Groups of 3 or 4 people can actually do a city builder pretty easily. Surprisingly sophisticated city builders, in fact. And they do sell quite well, but I think I had them overplaced. And my guess is they're going to start to drop. There's a little bit of oversaturation because there's just so many of the things right now. So, yeah, we're going to move that down into... I think it's still a strong market, but it's definitely... doesn't deserve to be on the same plane as co-op. I still believe for at least another year, co-op is going to be king. Probably, 2027, maybe even near the end of 2026, we're going to start to see that decay a little bit. But for right now, co-op games are just such winners right now. Putting anything else on the same level as co-op doesn't feel right. So we're going to leave that in a category all its own. I almost feel like I should rename this co-op just to really emphasize the fact that nothing else belongs here. But let's move down. I don't really have any plans for this. I'm just going to pick out things as I see them. Let's start with visual novels. I'm actually going to move that down. Not because anything's changed. I've said for the last 2 years that visual novels never change. It's one of those really slept-on genres where they're just not sexy. Unless you get something like Doki Doki Literature Club where everybody's talking about it, or Slay the Princess, which is what I use for my art here, nobody really cares about them, but there is a very, very loyal audience for these games that just buy absolutely everything. And that's why I generally have VNs placed pretty high. I feel like it's not a genre to go in if you want to sell 1 million units and make a ton of money and be famous, but if you just want to find your niche, I think it's really good. It's really easy for small developers to work with. That being said, I took a quick look at some of the numbers before I started doing this video, and VNs, I think I've always had them overplaced. It's a decent kind of mid-level genre, but putting that in the same level as like deck builders doesn't feel right. So I'm moving that down. And while I'm here, I'm moving adventure down as well. And this is based on the interviews I did for State of Indie, but also just with things like the trailer review, which is there are a lot of amazing looking adventure games out there that just don't sell as well as it seems like they should. And I think with adventure, you get into a situation, whereas one of the people I talked to is the guy who, oh God, I don't remember the studio, but the game was Rosewater. Rosewater is a really good looking game. But what he said was that with adventure, a couple years ago, if you had like a high quality adventure game, like a high production quality adventure game that had that kind of vintage LucasArts look to it, that was enough. But these days, there are more people doing this, and as more people move into this space, it's harder and harder to stand out. So just looking good, just looking great, is not enough. So I do still think that adventure games are slept on. There's a big market for these. It's one of those genres that people in the industry, and even in the indie space, keep trying to kill off. There are people who love these games, but it's surprisingly competitive these days. So I think as far as adventure goes, it need to be dropped down a spot. Now, what else do we want to look at? Let's look at some of my weirder ones. I put racing in last time because there were a few racing games showing up here and there. There aren't a lot. This is definitely, these days, very AAA dominant, but you did have a few little games. There was this like kart racer where it was either the developer or their PR people were really desperate for me to review it. And I don't know what to do with games like this. I don't like racing games. So I'm not the person to review racing games. And looking at the numbers, it definitely need to be dropped down a spot. I don't know a lot of developers where this is kind of their dream project is racing, but if they are, it's just, you're competing against the biggest names in the business. No matter what you do, nobody's doing simulationists, but even if you do an arcade style game, you're fighting Nintendo, you're fighting Sega, you're not going to win that fight. And, I've even seen some interesting looking indie racing games that I think could have been kind of cool if they'd been released maybe 5 years ago, but right now it's a terrible, terrible, terrible spot for it. And as long as we're moving things down, I have a feeling I'm going to be demoting more things than I promote. I'm moving strategy back to where I had it. I moved strategy up when I reassessed this mid-year. I'm moving it back down. The basis for that was Civilization and EU5, mainly. You had these big games coming out in big franchises. I kept it low initially because of Civ, and then Civ 7 wasn't exactly warmly received, so I bumped it up. But I'm looking around, and there are a lot of really interesting indie strategy games that are just never going to take off. I think I had a commenter a while back say that there was nothing more conservative than strategy game fans, and that's true. These are people, they stick with the same franchises year after year after year, and just these grand strategy fans, 4X, anything like that, they're not really interested in branching out. They're not interested in trying anything new. Obviously, I'd like to be proven wrong here because there are some really neat looking indie strategy games, grand strategy games even, like Paradox Interactive level shit that will be coming out hopefully next year, maybe in the next 5. I don't know. These things are always tenuous. But my guess is they're all going to be ignored because that's just where we are. Strategy is really tough to break into right now, and I think it's tough no matter who you are. Even if you're A tier, it's difficult. All right, what else do we have in here? Horror. I don't know. Question for the audience: what would you do with horror right now? Because honestly, I'm very puzzled. I could make a case for putting horror in any of these 6 tiers. I talked to a couple of horror developers for State of Indie. And the advantage you get with horror is that the main advantage you get with horror is that people are willing to accept a product that's rough around the edges. It is a wonderful starting point for solo developers or anyone working with zero budget because these games can look like shit and people still love them. And even among the indies, it is kind of unique. A lot of these, like if I go back to like JRPGs, people still kind of expect JRPGs to look pretty good. People expect city builders to look at least okay, but horror can have visuals where you barely know what's going on and people are still okay with them. That's the only advantage, though. It is a massively oversaturated market. There are all these trends that are constantly changing, so that if you start making a game now and it takes you more than like 6 months, you're gonna, whatever trend you were trying to chase will be gone. The advantage here is you can make these things quickly, and you have to. Like, honestly, if it's gonna take you more than 6 months, I'm not sure it's worth doing horror, because the trends are just moving in and out so quick. Like right now, co-op horror is still a big deal, but it's kind of moving out of that, and we're moving into other things, and I don't know what's going to be next. I just feel every single year, I feel like I have to say horror is overplaced. Everyone who does videos like this, they pick out like the 2 or 3 meme games that make all the money, and they say that this is proof that horror is the best genre, but for most people it's not. And I don't even know if there are any big meme games this year. In fact, I'm dropping this. Let's put this in middling. I think horror is actually fairly weak right now. I'm sure at some point in 2026 there'll be some new trend, and then everyone's going to chase that trend, and it'll all come back, and you'll have hundreds more videos saying the horror is king. Yeah. I don't think it's there. I just don't think it's there right now. I look around and I just keep seeing horror games underperforming, and it feels like the ones that succeed is because the developers frankly didn't put that much effort into it or that much time. And that's the advantage you have. And you have these people who are taking 3 years to make a horror game, and it's too much. Too much. All right, what else do we have? Need to move something up. It's starting to look like my predictions for 2026 are really dire. Oh, what needs to go up? Not action. God, action roguelikes. There are, I looked at some numbers really quick, and there are some action roguelike games that are selling relatively well, but it's mostly because they're very cheap. They're not making that much money. CRPGs. We're 2 years out from Baldur's Gate 3. I'm going to move this up to middling. As someone who's never been a big fan of computer-style RPGs, it's hard for me to assess these. As someone who's a big fan of RPGs, but only specific types, I know I've probably got JRPGs overplaced. In fact, let's bump those down. Even though JRPGs, by the numbers, are still doing really, really well, like surprisingly well. And because there's nothing really great coming out, there's not a lot of competition, but also not a lot of attention on them. So I'm going to go ahead and move that down and move CRPGs up. That's mostly a gut check, I'll admit. But I feel comfortable with it. RPGs are always difficult. We really have entered this era of video games where everything is an RPG. Everything has RPG elements to it right now. There are no pure action games released anymore. People think pure action games are boring. They want everything to have stats and an upgrade tree. And it's made it weird for games that are only trying to be an RPG. Like, what the hell even are they? And it makes it weird to assess them. I still love JRPGs, which you're going to see once you see my Game of the Year list. I didn't look at that many of them this year, but the ones I did look at are going to make that list. But there's kind of a tough genre to place as far as pure RPGs go. What about ARPGs? I had ARPGs down the death slot. Why are they down here? Because it has become one of the essential AAA genres, and when something is dominated by AAA, indies lose. It's simple as that. But you know what? I am gonna cautiously bump these up a slot, because I've been looking at the numbers, and they're doing better than I would have thought. Like, for 2025, they did better. And I think the reason is that the smaller developers for action RPGs are beginning to acknowledge their role. Our ARPGs, because they are so A-tier dominated, they tend to be super, super high production value. They're very sexy, they're very polished, they're very flashy. And that's one of those areas where the indies just lose. When you're fighting on flash, when you're fighting on visuals, you are going to lose the matchup. But I've seen a number of ARPG developers, smaller ones, who have started to acknowledge their limitations. They're making the games look a little bit smaller. They're kind of drawing down the visuals, often going for a retro look, this kind of fifth generation throwback style. Very popular right now. Sixth generation throwbacks getting to be popular as well. You adopt one of those, late 90s, early aughts styles, and it's okay that the game doesn't look, super, super ultra high end, whatever the hell the A tier guys are doing right now. It looks good enough, it plays well, and people are willing to accept that. That being said, you are still getting compared to the A tier guys. That's always the problem. It doesn't matter if you are scaling it back. People compare indies to AAA games. That's just how it goes. So I'm willing to move ARPG up. I think they probably will gain some ground, since it also feels a little bit like AAA's moving away from this the slightest bit, which is going to be an advantage. I'm not willing to go above that second to last tier, though. What else do we have here? TRPGs are too high. That was a little bit of wishful thinking, but also based on the numbers. But I looked at the numbers again. TRPGs are funny. It's a subgenre people don't think about too much anymore. I went into the whole spiel about this last year, that there was a point where TRPGs were a great genre because people had rediscovered Final Fantasy Tactics. And, that's perhaps my favorite video game of all time. And it's a lot of people's favorite video game. And I'm finding out for a lot of people, it's their favorite Final Fantasy game. And because of that, a lot of people were looking for more games in that style, because we weren't seeing a lot of them at the time. And so anybody who was showing off that FFT-styled gameplay was getting a lot of attention. And these days, they don't get so much press for doing the same thing. And the numbers last year were surprisingly good, which led me to put TRPGs higher. But sitting here now, in the first place, I don't know if I reviewed any TRPGs this year. And and if I did, I can't remember them. I don't know if I played any. It just feels like nobody's doing these. And on the one hand, that could make it a really great one to move into if you're a developer, because there's no competition. I can't help but feel that there's a reason. And when I looked at the numbers, TRPGs have kind of sunk back down. So, I think they belong where they were. I think they always belong in this slot. TRPGs are a lot of fun. It's my favorite RPG subgenre, but it's so hard to do one well. And I think a lot of developers just don't have the chops for it. All right. Okay, there's one more thing I want to adjust, and I should have done this to begin with, but I kind of overlooked it until now. MSims. Let's talk about MSims again, because this was one of the big genres last year, not so much because there were a lot of games advertised as immersive simulation, but because there were a lot of games that had MSim elements. It was all over the place. Not so much this year, though. I think it's still okay. Oh, excuse me about that. I want to bounce it down a slot, though. I feel like immersive simulation games are starting to replace survival games. Survival games are still very popular. But MSims, to me, MSims feel like you're committing less of your life to it. Survival games are one of those things that feels like a second job you have to pay for, and MSims are like the lesser version of that. I'm sorry if I just insulted you. But believe me, dude, I play Paradox Interactive games. I play games that are basically spreadsheets, so I am not in a position to make fun of anybody for what they enjoy doing. Believe me. But I just feel like MSims are a little more accessible compared to survival. But I also can't think of that many games with MSim elements. It's been 2 years since 2 years ago I had Shadows of Doubt as my, number one game of the year. And that very clearly had MSim. That had MSim elements to an obnoxious degree where you had to keep eating and drinking, but then you'd eat and drink the wrong things and you'd get sick, and then you had to take a shower, and it was just way too much. That was the one thing I did not like about Shadows of Doubt. It it was an immersive simulation game where the ImSim elements were the worst part of it. But I just look around, I don't see as much of this. It does appear by the numbers these games are still doing quite well. I just feel like these require more resources than most developers have to work with. Shadows of Doubt was a long time in development, too, and it's not even done. Last I checked, they were still working on it. So I'm going to bump that down one slot. I think that games with these elements are still doing okay, but putting them back close to the top doesn't quite feel right. Everything else here, I think I'm going to keep everything else where it is. I haven't been paying enough attention to first-person shooters to know if I should move them back to middling. I'm going to keep them where they are, because the boomer shooter thing is done. They still come out, people still buy them, but nobody really cares about them that much anymore. You know, the handful of first-person shooters to do really well out of the indie space tend to be ones that have really novel mechanics, and we haven't seen too many of those in a while. So I think I'm comfortable leaving that there. Everything else, yeah, Cozy's there. Yeah, it's all fine. So this is where I'm going to put my tier list going into 2026. Admittedly, it's pretty early. There could be some slam bang amazing wave of games that comes out in the next month and a half that makes this look foolish before we've even started, but I feel comfortable with this. I would like to hear your take on it. If you have any, especially if you feel like there are any subgenres or styles that I did not include in here and that you think I should have, by all means put that down in the comments. Otherwise, I guess we'll be revisiting this in about 4 or 5 months when we find out how wrong I was.